Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1877, the wind pulled hard across the open prairie, carrying the dust of a long trail and the scent of rain that never quite came. On a rutted road east of Casper, a woman in a faded blue dress stood outside a small sod house, holding a tin plate with 2 thick slices of bread. The sound of hooves crunching the dry dirt made her turn. He came slow on a bay gelding, tall in the saddle, his frame lean, clothes worn but clean. A rifle was slung across his back and his hat shaded a face that looked like it had not smiled in years. He did not speak, just halted a few yards from her and nodded once. She stepped forward, holding out the plate. "You hungry?" Her voice was quiet but steady. He looked down at the bread like he had not seen food in a while. Then he dismounted, his boots landing quiet on the earth. He took the bread without a word, his hands rough and tanned, and sat on the edge of the well, eating like a man who knew to be grateful without showing much of it. She watched him, arms crossed. "Name's Sadie Ellwood." He looked up, chewing slow. "Harlan Rhodes," he said, voice gravel deep with a drawl that did not belong to any one place. Sadie nodded. "You headed west." Harlan folded the empty tin plate in his hands. "Just follow in the road." There was silence between them, but it did not feel empty. The wind moved across the tall grass beside the road. Behind her, the house stood small and square, with a slanted roof and smoke rising from the chimney. A child's wooden ball lay forgotten in the dirt near the door. "I got coffee," she said. He nodded once and followed her inside. The inside of the sod house was plain but neat. A small table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a door that led to a second room. Dried herbs hung from a beam, and a cast iron stove gave off a low heat. "Sit," Sadie said, pouring coffee from a tin pot. She set it in front of him, then sat across from him with her own cup. He did not ask questions, and she did not offer much. But after a long silence, he looked up. "That ball by the door," her eyes softened. "My boy Amos, he's 6, she hesitated. "And my daughter Alma, she's 4. They're both asleep in the back." He nodded, then looked back at his cup. "My husband's buried out behind the barn," she added, voice flat now. "Fell sick last winter." There was not much anyone could do. Harlan looked up at her for a long moment, no pity in his eyes, just quiet understanding, like he had seen more graves than he cared to count. "I manage," she said, "but it gets quiet out here, hard." He finished his coffee and stood. "You need help with anything?" She blinked, surprised. "You offering?" He nodded once. "I need the well mended," she said. "And the roof's got a leak." "I can fix both," he said, and he did. The next morning he was out early shoring up the well with new boards from her shed. By noon he was on the roof, hammering quiet and steady. Sadie brought him water, then stew for lunch. He ate on the porch, the children shyly watching him from behind the doorframe. Amos stared at his rifle with wide eyes. "Are you a soldier?" "No," Harlan said simply. Alma tugged at Sadie's skirt. "He looks like a giant." Sadie smiled faintly. "He's just tall, sweetheart." By the 3rd day, the leak was gone, the well ran clean, and Harlan had patched the fence around the goat pen. He did not talk much, but he always came in when Sadie called, ate what she offered, and drank coffee slow like it was the only comfort he allowed himself. That evening, after the children had gone to sleep, Sadie stepped out onto the porch and found him sitting on the bench he had fixed, polishing his rifle. "You ever stay long in one place?" she asked. "No," she sat beside him. "Why now?" He looked ahead at the horizon where the sun had just slipped below the hills. "You offered bread," she smiled at that, "and you stayed." He turned to her, his face unreadable. "You do not look scared out here, but you are." "I have 2 little ones," she said softly. "I cannot afford to be scared," he nodded. "I know that feeling." She looked up at him, trying to understand what was behind that quiet voice. "You lost someone," he nodded once, slow. "A long time ago." After a pause, he said, "My wife and daughter. Fever took them in Texas. I left after that." "Kept going." She looked down at her hands. "I know what that kind of loss feels like." They sat in silence for a while. The stars came out and the night cooled. "You could stay," she said finally, "if you wanted." He looked at her then, really looked. You sure? Sadie did not blink. I do not offer twice. He gave a slow nod. Then I will stay. And just like that, something settled between them, not love yet, but something close. Something that might grow. The next morning, Amos followed Harlan around like a shadow. Alma brought him a flower she picked from near the barn. Sadie watched from the porch, arms folded, her heart doing something it had not done in a long time, hoping. That night, with the children asleep again, she poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. You think you could ever start again? She asked. Harlan looked at her, long and quiet. Maybe. She leaned back in the chair beside him. I think I already have. He reached over, slow and careful, and took her hand, just held it, no words, but it was enough. For now, the morning after the rain, the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Harlan was already at the edge of the pasture when Sadie stepped outside, her shawl drawn tight against the chill that lingered beneath the sun. She watched him string a new line of wire along the north fence, hands steady, movements patient. Sadie crossed the yard, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. That wire from the shed? She asked as she approached. He nodded, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Found a coil behind the hay. She crouched beside the post, checked the tension he'd set. It's been slack for months. I kept meaning to fix it, but I never had the time between the children and the stock. You got cattle, just the one heifer and a milk cow. She glanced toward the barn. Had more once, sold them when the feed got thin. He didn't speak. Just took the next length of wire and began threading it through the hole he'd bored. Sadie stood, brushing her palms on her skirt. I was thinking, she said, if you're staying a while, it might make sense to build a smokehouse. Winter's not as far off as it feels. He paused, looked up. You got meat to cure. I'm hoping to. There's a trader comes through from Fort Laramie every few weeks. I've got butter and eggs to trade, sometimes extra goat's milk. If you're handy with a rifle, we might have venison enough to keep. He nodded slowly. I can hunt. She studied him for a long moment. You do everything quiet, he met her eyes. Noise doesn't fix much. She couldn't help the faint smile that touched her. No. I suppose it doesn't. Later, while Sadie churned butter in the kitchen, Amos sat at the table carving a small block of wood with a table knife, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth. Alma lay on her stomach near the hearth, drawing in the dust with a stick. Mama, is he gonna live here now? Alma asked without looking up. Sadie kept her hand steady on the churn. Maybe if he wants to. Does he have a bed? Amos asked. He's been sleeping in the loft, she said, but I was thinking come fall we might clear the storage room. Make it proper. The boy nodded, satisfied, and went back to shaping wings on the back of his block horse. That evening, Harlan brought back a young buck slung over his shoulder. He set to work beneath the cottonwood by the barn, skinning and quartering with practiced efficiency. Sadie brought him a basin of hot water and a clean cloth. You get this far on your own? He asked, not looking up. She handed him the cloth. I did. He cleaned his hands slowly. That takes more than most have. Sadie leaned against the tree. I didn't think about what it would take. I just knew I couldn't go back east after he passed. His people made it clear we weren't welcome without him. He looked over at her then, quiet for a moment. Mine were the same, she nodded, not surprised. It's a hard thing not being claimed. He folded the cloth and set it aside. It is. That night, after the children had gone to sleep and the fire had burned low, Sadie stepped outside. She found him sitting on the porch, sharpening his knife by lantern light. She sat beside him, hands in her lap. I don't know what you were before this, she said, and I won't ask unless you offer, but if you're willing to build something here, I won't look behind you. He turned toward her, the knife still in his hand, gleaming faintly. I did things I had to do, never for pleasure. Never to the innocent. She met his gaze. That's enough for me. He looked down at her hand resting near his. Slowly, he reached over, not to take it, but to let his fingers rest just beside hers, close enough to feel the warmth. They sat like that until the lantern burned low and the stars turned overhead. Inside, the children slept soundly. Outside, the land breathed in the dark, quiet as a held breath. The next morning, he began digging the footing for the smokehouse, and Sadie brought him breakfast without a word. By midsummer, the smokehouse stood finished beneath the cottonwood, its walls of split pine tight and dry. Inside, hams and venison hung from new rafters, the scent of hickory curling beneath the door. The garden rows behind the sod house had taken root beans climbing their poles, squash spreading low and wide, and corn pushing taller each day. Harlan had spent long hours turning that soil, coaxing it into something useful. Sadie noticed how he moved without needing direction, as though the rhythm of labor anchored him. One evening, after supper, Harlan sat on the porch sharpening a hoe blade. Sadie stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, and leaned against the post. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting the world in copper light. "You ever think about owning land?" she asked, nodding toward the pasture. "Making something yours?" He didn't answer right away. The rasp of the stone against metal paused, resumed. "Then, I never thought I'd be still long enough to want that." She watched him work. "I figured that was something men like you gave up on a long time ago." He set the blade down and stretched his leg out, slow, like something in his hip had stiffened. "I didn't give up. I just didn't know where to stop walking." Sadie stepped down the porch steps, brushing past the lavender bush she'd planted near the door. "You stopped here." He looked at her then, eyes steady. "I did." That night, when the air cooled and the children had slipped into sleep without fuss, Sadie lit a single lantern and stayed at the table, mending a tear in Alma's dress. Harlan came in from the barn, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. He set his hat on the peg by the door and paused, watching her. "You sew like you're fixing something more than cloth," he said. She didn't look up. "Some things you mend because they need it, some things because you need to." He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat. "Which is this?" She tied off the thread and leaned back. "Maybe both." They sat a while without speaking. Outside, the wind moved through the high grass. Sadie reached for the tin of buttons beside her, fingers brushing over the worn brass ones she'd saved from her husband's old coat. "These belonged to him," she said, voice low. "I kept them even after I gave the coat away." Harlan didn't touch them. "You still carry him," she met his eyes. "I carry the years, the quiet, the weight of what I had to be after." He nodded, fingers laced together on the table. "I've got a tin too, just bullets instead of buttons." They didn't smile. But something passed between them, solid and understood. The next morning, Sadie rode into town with Amos behind her on the mule. Alma stayed with Harlan, who repaired the barn door with an old hinge he'd found in the shed. She followed him from a safe distance, carrying her cloth doll in one arm and a pail of nails in the other. "You're not like the men that came before," she said when he paused to drink. He glanced over. "That's so. The others didn't fix things." He took the pail from her and set it down. "Sometimes fixing is all a man can offer." She watched him for a moment, then placed her doll by the door and went to sit in the shade. When Sadie returned, she carried a sack of salt and a new spool of thread, her face flushed from sun and dust. That night she found Harlan in the pasture, leaning on the fence post, watching the goats settle. She stepped beside him, arms crossed over her chest. "It's a strange thing, having someone to come home to." He didn't move. "It's a good thing." She turned her face toward the sky where the stars were just beginning to show. "I used to wonder what it'd feel like, not being alone at the end of the day. You don't have to wonder anymore." She looked at him then, the lines of his face caught in the silver-blue dusk. "You think you could stay through winter?" "I could." He didn't look away. "If there's a place for me." "There is." He reached out slow and touched her wrist, just enough to feel the warmth of her skin. She didn't pull away. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed, no longer hollow, but full of promise. The first frost came early that year, silvering the grass before dawn and leaving the edges of the water trough stiff with ice. Sadie stood at the stove, rubbing warmth into her hands as the coffee boiled. She moved slower in the mornings now, her joints stiff from the cold that crept through the walls no matter how tightly the shutters were drawn. Harlan came in from the barn, boots damp, his coat dusted with hay. He set a small sack on the table. "Trap line had luck," he said. She opened it and saw 3 rabbits neatly cleaned. "I'll stew them with turnips," she said, reaching for the kettle. "You've got a way with quiet things." He poured himself a cup and leaned against the wall, watching her. "You always know how to make do?" she asked. "I had to. My father drank through most harvests when I was young. If I wanted to eat, I learned how." Sadie set the kettle back on the stove and turned. "I used to think folks who grew up hard turned cruel, but you're not." He looked down at his cup. "I've been close to it. But I never crossed the line." She walked over, close enough to see the lines time had etched into his face. "You think some people are just born kinder. I think some people hold on to what they've lost different than others." That afternoon, he took the children into the hills behind the pasture. Sadie watched from the garden, her hands deep in the soil as she pulled the last of the beets. When they came back, Alma's dress was streaked with clay, and Amos carried a pine cone in each hand, proud as a king. "They found a spot with fox tracks," Harlan said, lifting Alma down from the mule. "I showed them how to tell which way it was headed." Sadie wiped her hands on her apron. "Didn't think you were the teaching sort," he glanced at her. "I wasn't, not until now." That night, Sadie lit the lantern early. The wind had picked up and the sky was the color of split stone. She stitched by the fire, her needle passing through thick wool, steady and quiet. Harlan sat nearby, whittling a narrow piece of cedar. The children were already tucked in, their breathing soft behind the door. "You ever think about what kind of man you'd be if things had gone different?" she asked. "I used to. And now," he set the cedar aside. "Now I think about what kind I still might be." She folded the fabric and looked at him. "You have a plan for that?" "I stay, I build, I protect what's here." She reached out and touched the back of his hand. "That's more than most ever promise." He didn't move away. A week later, Sadie sent Amos on an errand down the ridge to where the creek met the cottonwoods. Harlan stood with her as she watched the boy disappear into the trees. "You trust him out alone?" he asked. "He's careful, and he listens." Harlan nodded. "You raised him to be that." She turned toward him. "We did now." She didn't say more. She didn't have to. Later that evening, Harlan brought in a bundle of dried sage and hung it near the hearth. The smell filled the room, clean and sharp. "What's it for?" Sadie asked. "Back home, we burned it when winter came. Thought it kept sickness out." "Where was home?" "Near the Brazos, before everything went wrong," she nodded. "We all come from somewhere we had to leave." That night, as the fire burned low, Sadie stepped outside to check the shutters. Harlan followed, wordless, and stood beside her. The stars were clear, the air sharp with cold. "If you hadn't come down that road," she said, "I don't know where we'd be now." He looked over at her. "Same for me." She reached for his hand. This time she didn't let go. He didn't need to speak. Everything he meant was in the way his fingers curled firm around hers, steady and warm. The cold wind passed around them, but it didn't touch the place where they stood. The first snow came before the lanterns were lit. Thick flakes drifted down through the dusk, softening the earth and blanketing the pasture where the goats huddled near the fence. Harlan stepped back from the shed, wiped his hands on a rag and looked toward the house. Through the small window, he could see Sadie pulling Alma's shawl tighter around her shoulders, her mouth moving as she sang something low and melodic that he couldn't hear. He closed the shed door against the cold and crossed the yard, the snow crunching under his boots. Inside, the warmth hit him full in the chest wood smoke, stew, and the faint scent of lye soap. Sadie turned as he stepped through the door, her eyes narrowing slightly the way they did when she was measuring something unsaid. "You finished the new cradle?" she asked, nodding toward the back room. He unwrapped the cloth from his hands. "It's solid, rockers won't shift." She poured him a mug of cider and set it on the table without looking at him. "Alma's outgrown hers. I wasn't sure you'd be willing." "I wanted to," he said simply. "Felt right." Sadie leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. "You ever think about what it'd mean staying past planting, not just through a winter?" "I've thought about nothing else," he said, eyes steady on hers. She looked down at her hands for a long moment, then back at him. You're not a man who talks just to fill the quiet, so if you say that, I believe you." He stepped closer. "I want to build more than fences, more than smokehouses. I want to build with you." Her breath caught, but she didn't turn away. "You sure? This isn't a life that gives back easy." His voice was low, clear. "You give back enough for both of us." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Sadie lit a second lantern and brought out a small wooden box. Inside were the land documents her husband had filed before he passed. She laid them on the table beside Harlan's cup. "It's not much," she said, "but it's legal. 40 acres, water rights, and a claim that still holds." Harlan scanned the pages, then looked up. "You kept it in your name." "Didn't see any reason to change it," she said. He nodded slowly. "Would you let me put my name beside yours?" Sadie didn't answer at first. She moved to the window, pulled the curtain back just enough to see the whitened pasture. When she turned, her face was calm, but her eyes held something new, something settled. "I would," she said. The next week, they rode into Casper, Sadie in her best wool coat and Harlan in a clean shirt that still bore a faint scent of pine from the cupboard. The justice of the peace was a short man with a long mustache and a quiet voice. The small office smelled of ink and dried tobacco. When he asked if they had witnesses, Sadie nodded to Amos and Alma, standing solemn at the doorway holding hands. The ceremony was short. No rings, just promises. Harlan's voice didn't waver. Sadie's was clear as creek water in spring. On the ride home, Alma fell asleep against her brother's shoulder, and Sadie's gloved hand slipped into Harlan's as the mule plodded slow and steady through the snow-packed trail. Come late February, the goat kidded 3 strong little ones. Amos built a pen from leftover planks, while Alma named each of them after colors she liked: blue, hazel, and red. Sadie taught her how to milk by lamplight, both of them wrapped in shawls, breath visible in the chill. One evening, as Harlan repaired the latch on the garden gate, Sadie stepped out with a basket of warm bread and a small jar of blackberry jam she'd bartered for in town. "I've been thinking," she said, handing him the basket. "Come spring, we ought to plant a second row of beans. If we're going to have another mouth to feed." He paused mid-motion. "Another," she nodded, smile faint but sure. "I've been counting the days and the signs." He stepped forward, caught her waist gently. "You sure?" "I am." He pressed his forehead to hers, rough hand against the curve of her cheek. "Then we build another cradle." By the thaw, the land had softened, and the creek behind the pasture sang louder each morning. Harlan planted corn beside the fence line while Amos dug a line for potatoes. Alma helped Sadie start tomatoes in jars on the windowsill. The house smelled of bread, earth, and something new, something like hope. In late summer, Sadie gave birth to a daughter, strong, lunged, and dark-haired. They named her Eliza, after a woman Sadie had once known who never stopped fighting to survive. Harlan carved her a cradle from the same cedar he'd used for the others. He lined it with soft wool and placed it beside their bed. That night, with the baby sleeping sound between them, Sadie turned toward him, her fingers brushing his. "You built a life out of nothing," she whispered. He pulled her close, voice low. "You gave me the pieces." They lay in the quiet, the sound of the wind through the eaves above them, and the soft weight of peace settling into the walls of the house they shared. Nothing grand, nothing easy. Just honest work, honest love, and the kind of stillness that comes at the end of a long, hard road, and they stayed. Through storms and seasons, through new births and quiet evenings. Together they built a life that held.